Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversations that we've been having about Moten and the worker strike. I've had a really good time doing this whole series because I definitely think it's been really interesting to talk about what I think will be such a core, nuanced argument for the worker strike resolution for Lincoln Douglas, and what I think will definitely have a lot of things to offer on both the affirmative and the negative, and I think requires an evolution of responses from people from all different types of perspectives. And I definitely think that this series has been really helpful in trying to figure out like what those developments are going to look like and how they kind of like specifically change the terms of like what you would debate about on the worker strike resolution. And I'm hoping that we can kind of continue with a lot of the conversations that we've been having before. In the last video, I would definitely watch it before you watch this video, because this video is a direct continuation of that, where we kind of originally started talking about Moten and Harney's arguments on the affirmative on the resolution as possible critical arguments against the worker strike resolution, and what that will look like in terms of how you should be framing these arguments, what your kind of like ideas should be, and what types of like key theoretical ideas you might have for like what types of problems you want to take with the resolutions and ways to critique it, ways that you should be answering case arguments, framework arguments, and T arguments, and why I think that you should kind of like go as left as possible in those cases, because I think that that really allows you the best diversity of responses against the type of arguments that you'll see. And in this video I want to kind of continue on with that and talking about like things like the criticism, the counterplay, and the dissad, to really think about how all of these different sources get answered by this affirmative and like what your core arguments are. I think that the first thing that you'll kind of definitely see is I think that against K teams, the cap K will be read a lot, because I feel like the interesting thing is that a lot of the arguments that the critical teams will make in terms of what is wrong with a worker strike, I feel like it kind of turns into a debate about the very resolution. The negative team could either take up the worker strike or the resolution for basically as a counterplan or as an alternative to the affirmative, or they could read a different type of cap K argument about just why vertical organizing is good with or without state recognition, and kind of separate themselves from that. But I definitely think that there are interesting ways to apply and possibly do both, and so I definitely want to talk about the ways in which these arguments show up, kind of like how you should be responding to that kind of type of argument first, because I think it's very peculiar for this resolution. And I definitely think that the way that you should definitely hold a lot of these alternatives to is that either hold them to kind of this recognition of the state portion and allow yourself to develop a lot of good nuanced offense off of the state recognition portion of offense, or you can kind of decide to develop an argument that allows you to tie how vertical movements kind of organize themselves as a mimicry of the state. And so regardless of whether or not they do the forms of recognition, they still fall into like the traps of the forms of like structural violence that are permitted under the institution that like governmentality kind of like stands within, and is like able to kind of like intrude in terms of how it affects our social interactions with each other. And I think being able to address those types of criticisms as like impacts that happen at the inevitability level of how they could basically produce the same violence that the state is already reducing the world to in the status quo, or as an argument that in a world of the alternative, it makes it impossible for us to basically find the difference between what our resistance moves like and what the state does, because of the way in which we mimic those very same power structures, and the way in which that creates like forms of violence that basically make the kind of like models of extinction that a lot of these cap teams will cite as basically inevitable, because of the way that Moten and Harney are making arguments about how those kind of like same things are the desires that feed us into the types of paradigms that turn like vertical kind of like anti-capitalist movements into like these punitive centers that are measured as institutions with like stable accountability terms that don't actually hold them to a standard of like keeping people within keeping people safe, and like creating a space for people to be able to like assert themselves beyond a universal identity under capitalism. And so I think that even beyond that particular criticism, a lot of the other things that I would definitely push into being important into how Moten and Harney really generally answer a lot of criticisms is to make arguments about like why the question of the search for this kind of like perfect structural theory that is able to universally make arguments about the constrictions and freedoms of like particular populations to like move and create resistance, that there has to be a more contextual analysis of like what we use to take various type of tactics. And I think that although whether or not you're reading like military preservation as an argument, using a lot of the arguments that Moten and Harney kind of forward, especially in their article about Mike Brown, about the question of like what we take to the streets, becomes a really important paradigm for how you're able to kind of like assess the value of the 1AC versus the question of like the negative at an alternative level. And I think that putting pressure on the alternative like really forces them to like either go into a place where their response to structural violence is like too individualistic to resolve itself, or they're kind of like move into something like too stable, vertical, and institutional requires like the reinstantiation of the state and the possibility of state consumption. And I think that those things create like definite threats to the offense that a lot of these criticisms try to create. And I definitely think it allows you to make a lot better set of arguments against like the kind of like status quo the status quo in relationship to the link arguments, right? And making that comparison between like the world of the link arguments and the world that we live in now and the proximate causes of it. I then think that when you kind of like take some of this and advice and apply it to the counterplan dissent debate, I definitely think the counterplan debate is a place where teams can get really, really creative, not because they need to like create a whole lot of like intricate plan text, but I think because there can be a lot of different kind of like global and domestic advantages to like doing something like the recognition of workers' strike, that it could be a lot of like hybrid instances of reading things like the CAPK and counterplans, which I think would be a really interesting debate to take a lot of these affirmatives up on. I think that in being able to answer these things, I definitely think that overhedging yourself on the arguments about like the state itself and the way in which the state operates now without really answering on terms like your relationship and stance on how you're able to spill up and resolve the material consequences of like the more like capital based portions of the negative argument can make it a lot harder for you to win these debates. And so I definitely think that impact comparison becomes a huge part of how you really want to like build in a critique of like why their kind of like view of a universal theory of violence such as like capitalism is what allows them to kind of like make the justification for basic utilitarian calculus, which reinstantiates like the brushing over of structural differences between like how different bodies are positioned in relationship to violence. And I definitely think that using that to build out a lot of your arguments can be a really strong way to create impact turns towards the way in which they want to view the debate and make the debate kind of like palpable for judges to view it through like a normative policy analysis. And I think that combined with a lot of the policy and planning questions that we've been talking about since like the ideal version of the 1AC can make it a lot easier for you to answer these type of arguments and make like a really strong push out the gate that allows you to maybe like compress and like use a lot of the portions of the affirmative to weigh heavily against the negative and keep your answers consistent, but with like a diversity of offense that can come from various historical examples of like why those portions of state recognition that we've been kind of like talking about throughout this whole lecture like basically result in the failure of being able to actually remediate structural injustice. Hopefully this video was helpful and hopefully you'll keep tuning in to more videos. Yeah, thanks as always for watching.